Please join me in welcoming Leonard Gilroy.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's a real honor to be here today, and it's fantastic to follow such good speakers. I've known Wendell and seen him before. Also had some good presentations from the city, so I appreciate that. You guys actually brought out some themes that I'm going to talk about a little bit here today. Just by way of background, I work at Reason Foundation. We are a national free market think tank. We're sort of like the Kansas Policy Institute at the national level. We also put out Reason Magazine and have a video journalism, a Reason TV enterprise that we also do. So you may have run into us one way or another, either through our policy work or journalism or the video work. Just by a little bit more background, James just mentioned I work for a transportation consultancy. That's just a little bit off. I call myself a recovering urban planner. I have a master's degree in urban regional planning from Virginia Tech. I spent the first many years of my career working as an urban planning consultant, working for various governments, primarily in the South, in the Gulf South, New Orleans and that region. That's part of my work in the urban planning profession. Is one of the reasons I got out of it. I started to really question, and some of the themes that came up, I think you mentioned earlier, some of the housing affordability, and Wendell's slide was fantastic. The one that showed the planners with the curve going this way, the path going that way. That's kind of what I ran into personally, just through this, through my own professional career development. I started, when I had to go, and you have to do a lot of public meetings as a planner, and when you're working as a consultant for governments, you go and you basically are a de facto government planner. And I had to have these conversations with people that were just, after a while, it didn't sit right. Where I was basically in some form or another telling them that I, was micromanaging away their property rights, or making decisions based on a lack of what I would call real economic information. Planners don't tend to get a lot of that. They tend to go a lot of gut and intuition in their decision making. I don't mean to indict the planning profession on the 40,000 planners nationally, but I had a hard time reconciling my own personal beliefs with what was going on there. So I ended up at Reason Foundation, which tend to be a little more market driven and tries to look at how can we kind of achieve some of those same goals that we all want. I mean, planners are dealing with issues that affect what people want and how they live. A lot of us don't have a disagreement with that. We all want good communities, good streets. Many of us out there want poor people and maybe the infirmed or the elderly or people with medical conditions to have access to transit. It's not that, that we don't want those things or we don't share that vision. It's all about how do you get there and how do you make cost-effective decisions. So, anyway, that'll sort of transition hopefully into where I go today. Just the other quick thing on background is this is kind of relevant. This discussion right now here on your tax proposal is, I don't have a dog in that hunt. I'm agnostic on that. That's your decision as a community. I'm just going to weigh in with some maybe perspective on how I tend to view these things. And it's actually very personal to me right now because I live in Phoenix, by the way. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. And I'm currently serving I was appointed by a city councilman to a Citizens Commission on the Future of Phoenix Transportation. That's what we're called. But basically, our charge is to look at, we've had a dedicated sales tax for transit in the Phoenix area since 2000. It's called Transit 2000. It was a 0.4 cent sales tax, basically a fourth of a cent, 0.4 cents on the dollar sales tax that's been going on since 2000. And we're kind of getting to the near end of that, and the city is starting to look at a lot of the same issues. How do we deal with transit and how do we deal with streets? Those are the two things that we're charged with sort of mapping out how do we move forward into an uncertain future from a fiscal standpoint. So this issue that you're dealing with, transit, streets, I know you have other issues, water and economic development, that's also in your package. But I'm going to be looking at the transit and the streets part. And for me that's very personal because we're dealing with the exact same issues right now. Not enough money to deal with all the things that we want to do in Phoenix for transit. And then certainly, transit tends to get the high profile look there, but I don't know. I sort of sympathize with you on this because the transit rolls, buses roll on streets, cars roll on streets. Streets are kind of the neglected, stepchild of infrastructure, I think, at the local level. And so I feel sympathy when I hear your conversation where you can spend a lot more money and the condition of your streets is going to get worse. I mean, basically, if I am hearing you correctly, now maybe if there was an unlimited resources, you could deal with all these problems. Maybe if policymakers made different decisions, you could deal with these problems in a different way. But that's the reality. And this is not a reality that is uncommon. You're not dealing with an issue that we're not dealing with in Phoenix and that states aren't dealing with and that local governments aren't dealing with. So that's where I want to start. I want to give you some fiscal overview here because I'm sort of a fiscal guy. I tend to look at, the money is ultimately where this all boils down to. So where are we? I'm going to burn through this pretty quickly, but states, let's kind of zoom back to right at the beginning of the recession. States took a major hit. That trickles down to the local level too. But you basically had many years where states across the country were dealing with hundreds of billions of dollars. Is about, if you add it all up over the years, about $600 billion in budget deficits that they had to close. That meant budget cuts across the country to pretty much hit every state to a different degree. At the state level, revenues are starting to rebound for the last couple of years. So now states are basically hitting back to where they were in terms of overall revenues, back to where they were in 2008. Local governments, by contrast, they tend to lag in terms of fiscal recovery. So after a recession, so let's say the recession is here and time starts to move on, the states are going to pick up first in terms of recovery, then local governments are going to pick up later. There's a pretty big lag there. So at the local level, you had 6 straight years of revenue decline in cities nationally. 6 straight years of revenues dropping every single year. And that only turned around last year. In 2013 and 2014, you started to, so basically they plummeted and they started to tick back up. And so that's where cities are today. Cities are struggling, basically, across the country. Of course, Chicago is going to be a poster child of, how bad it can get. Other cities are recovering better. It's certainly, there's a mix there. But, overall, that's the picture. Moving forward, though, that picture is a little bit bleak, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the first couple minutes here. This is not going to get a lot better unless something happens in the economy where we skyrocket in terms of economic growth and we go off the charts. It doesn't appear that's going to happen. And you've got some major threats looming that make these challenges persistent moving forward. One of them, across the country, you've got, I'll just start, you can mix this up in any different kind of order, but I'll just start with one that we've been researching a lot at Region Foundation, which is pension liabilities. These are promises that governments have made to their employees that they have not been funding in most places. I don't know what your situation here in Wichita is. I'm not throwing you into that mix, but I would say it's something worth looking at. You have about between, at the state and local level, $1 to $4 trillion in unfunded pension liabilities. That means governments have promised employees a certain amount of money when they retire. They haven't been putting enough money away for it. So basically that $1 to $4 trillion, that's money that they've promised they're on the hook for, that they don't have the money to pay. So that's going to be a big problem. And, Chicago, again, would be sort of a poster child for, how bad that can get. And what that starts to do is it really starts to eat into other budget priorities. I can tell you in Phoenix right now, since 2000, annually, our money that we've paid towards pensions in the city of Phoenix went from about $25–30 million a year in 2000. Today, that's up to well over $150 million a year, just in a little bit more than a decade. That's $100 million a year that is not going to pave streets, that is not going to keep libraries open, that's not going to keep fire department or fire stations open. So that's a very real threat. This may sound abstract, but in the real world, that's money that is going here in the budget and not going to transit, roads, libraries, parks, all the things that people, the services and citizens come to expect. But that's not the only one. That's a big one. You start going into, that was just pensions. You start talking about what they've promised for healthcare. for retirees. That's another, I don't know the number, there's lots of different estimates out there. Safely I can say it's in the hundreds of billions that are unfunded. Beyond that, you have, well, that's just with the employees. What about just, rising costs out there, broadly speaking? You've got education costs that are rising, Medicaid costs that are rising. That's more of a state level issue, but it's one that certainly trickles down to the local government. If you get shared revenues from states, or even the federal government on some of these things, that can trickle down to the local level too. And then you have just some other issues like economic stagnation. You have a high growth in low wage jobs, which doesn't tend to do as much for your economy as it would if you had higher wage jobs, obviously. And then cuts at the federal level that trickle down certainly to local governments. So, if anybody is expecting more money to be coming from DC and transportation or transit or any of these other areas, I would love to have that kind of optimism. I don't see it. I don't think, this is just a state and local issue. We have a whole other set of fiscal calamities that are brewing at the federal level too. So we've got some problems. Bottom line is, this puts pressure on infrastructure. Every state in the country out there is looking for how do we get more money to do transportation, because we cannot rely on the federal government anymore. Our federal governing partner is no longer trustworthy in terms of helping us meet our own needs in terms of delivering the infrastructure that we need to power our economy. And if you look at real spending on transportation infrastructure, it's been on a significant decline, at least since 2002. That was just the most recent data I saw. Might even go back further. So we've got some major problems out there. The problems that Steve and Alan are dealing with are real, and they're going to continue. Whether or not whatever happens with the sales tax or not, these questions are going to loom. So I'm going to hit this real quick. The National League of Cities put out a city fiscal conditions report last week. What this just shows is that you have a lot of variability. This is 1990. It's hard to read here, so I'll just kind of summarize it. They asked city managers every year, were you better able or less able to meet your needs than you were last year? And so every year they ask this question, and what you see is a lot of variability. You see, in late 90s and the bubble before it burst, most people felt pretty good about their ability to meet their needs. And then you start to see these hits. In 2001, 9/11, that post-9/11 recession, you start to see more cities not able to meet their needs. And then what you see here, this is illustrating that most recent recessionary decline. Recently, you have 80% of city managers who are reporting, this year we were better able to meet our needs than last year. But that's a low bar. Look at what they're coming off of. They're coming off of, about 5-6 years of straight revenue decline. So, we might be recovering a little bit, but, I would not put a lot of that being a trend. Okay, so let's talk about, just real quick, year-over-year changes in revenues and expenditures. And you see a lot of, variability here. This is that gap I was talking about. This is when the revenues were declining. But what you see moving forward is that even with a little bit of recovery, you have cities that are getting ready to, they expect more expenditures than revenues moving forward. So this is what they're projecting for next year is revenue or expenditures going up by 1%, and revenues going down by 0.5%. So again, there's a lot of variability, but at least in the near term, it's not looking very good. This is relevant to your discussion about sales taxes. This shows, I know it's kind of complex here, but the red one is sales tax revenues over the last few years. And what you see here, if you just kind of look at red versus property taxes and income taxes, the other two, the red one is much more volatile. Sales taxes are very volatile, and so one thing I would just question, if I was voting on this, I would just want to know, if they're banking on, and I forget, it was about $400 million in revenue over 5 years. I asked this question at a meeting of my commission in Phoenix last week, because they were projecting, if we extend our sales tax, what the revenues would be. And I asked the simple question, well, what's that based on? This is a 20-year period, not 5. But I asked, what kind of growth are you assuming in that revenue? The numbers you're telling us you're going to get, what is that based on? It came back that they were basing it on an almost 5% annual increase in sales taxes. That would be like this line, this red line, just going straight up. And I said, are you serious? Your numbers are fantasy. You think you're going to get every single year for 20 years, almost 5% annual growth in sales taxes, and that's what you want to try to get me as a commissioner to make a decision on, and then you maybe want to take that to voters and basically lie to them and tell them you're going to have all this money and make promises about what you're going to do with it, and then that money is a fantasy? I would just ask about what are the assumptions built into the numbers that you're going to be looking at. Because this is the reality. This is 1996 and today, and what you see is sales taxes are very volatile, and you have many years where it's negative growth, okay? So that's just another reality that you may have to contend with here. If you're banking on X million dollars off of this for, street improvements, for instance, what happens if 2 years from now, you get this year? What happens to that money? It's gone. It doesn't exist. So it's just some context here to keep in mind. Last thing out of the National League of Cities report, they just asked the city managers, what factors have the biggest impact on your budget, both positive and negative? And some of the things I mentioned are the most negative ones. Infrastructure was number one, right? So 50% of them said that's a negative factor. And that just means that these are things that are likely to persist in the future or hold us back, in terms of our recovery. Beyond that, it's employee benefits, health, retiree or pensions, healthcare benefits, right? Wages and salaries. So these are very real issues that you need to put this sales tax discussion into context. This is where you come. And so the last thing, I won't belabor this anymore, but last year the U.S. Government Accountability Office, it's basically Congress's research arm, put out a report where they're showing a growing this is state and local total altogether, a growing mismatch between revenues and expenditures, meaning expenditures higher than revenues, and that delta between the two rising for the next 50 plus years. Okay, so through the year 2060, this is what they're expecting, is a growing gap between revenues and expenditures, and that's a problem. That's a problem if you're a local government. You're going to have to deal with that, and it's because of all the same issues, healthcare and pensions and all the other issues. Okay, so just I want to throw a little bit more context in here, going to local roads and transit. On transit, Wendell did a great job of this, so I'm just going to summarize this a little bit. You have about less than 1% of total travel being done through transit in Wichita today. It's heavily subsidized. It looks like you're getting a fare box recovery, if I saw your numbers correctly, at about 15%. So revenues aren't covering, or fare box revenues aren't covering much of that. And this is something that we really see nationally. There's not much different here than what you see in most places outside of the big cities that he mentioned. But just in terms of context, one of the things that people don't quite realize is that transit in the U.S. was largely privatized until about somewhere in the mid-1950s, when through a lot of different decisions at the federal level, transit agents, public sector transit agencies took over private transit services. And so now you basically have not a lot of tension in the system or competition. You have basically a government monopoly on the provision of public transit, and then you also have rules that the feds have imposed that basically require public transit systems to be unionized. What does that mean? It means that those pension and labor costs, those become even more salient issues for local transit agencies, because you're basically bargaining with unions who are going to be pushing you very hard on raising salaries, raising pension benefits, it possibly beyond what is conceivably fiscally sustainable in some places. And so even when you talk about, we've basically, transit funding has overall been on an upward trajectory nationally. What we tend to see is that the workers tend to benefit from that spending more so than the users because of those labor cost issues. And that a lot of the spending, you saw it on the chart there earlier, I think it was almost 55-60% of your budget is going towards salaries and wages. Wages and benefits. And that doesn't necessarily often translate into the same level of increased service for users. Moving into roads, we just heard about this, so I won't belabor it, but proper road maintenance is something that is very beneficial to the community overall, but it's also very costly and it's not very sexy. What is sexy is when politicians get to go out and with the golden shovels and break ground on new projects, but keeping up the maintenance on an existing road that's on the ground is totally unsexy, and so most people don't see it. It's very easy to defer maintenance on it, meaning spend the money elsewhere and don't spend on what you need to do on an annual basis to keep, say, a new road up to good condition. And so what tends to happen is you defer the maintenance, and as we heard Alan say very well earlier, the longer that you defer maintenance on any type of infrastructure, the higher the cost. So that becomes a big issue. Now, you also have lots of piecemealing going on in maintenance, and I'm going to talk about the role for public-private partnerships, privatization, that sort of thing. But what we tend to see is a lot of inefficiency in the way that a lot of maintenance is contracted out by governments. Governments don't, I mean, some do a lot in-house, it's pretty typical to contract out a lot of maintenance work, but what we tend to see is that it tends to be very disaggregated. And so rather than contracting out lots of maintenance-related services, you might have a snow plowing contract, a contract with the guy to do the pavement sealing and that crack sealing, pothole repair, that kind of thing, signage, landscaping, all kind of separated out in very short term. So maybe a 1-year contract, that kind of thing. 1 to 3 year contracts are very common and that sort of thing. And I'll come back to different ways people have come to think about that. Really, I mean, what we've seen though, given the funding crunch, is that the state level has really been the level that has been very, very innovative so far, and looking at how can we find new revenue sources, how can we do things differently. Local governments, I think, have generally been relatively limited. I think what Alan was doing with the pavement, I forget what you call it, but your pavement management system, that kind of thinking is very good. You're very lucky to have that going on. Not every community does that yet. That will at some point become an institutional practice. But really being able to look at maintenance and put a value on your road system and think of cost benefit and think of it in those kinds of economic terms, that's the only way you're going to really convince policymakers how important it is and what the sensitivity to different changes of how much we put into the system and how we prioritize things. That's where you're going to get some good bang for the buck. So it's very good that you're doing that. That's still kind of relatively limited at the local level so far. But one of the things that we have been seeing a lot of at the local level is looking at, and I use this term very broadly, public-private partnerships. That could be a lot of different things. That could be competitive contracting things out. That could be going and looking for advertising revenues on transit buses, that sort of thing. We do a lot of that in Phoenix. In fact, in Phoenix, we contract out, our transit people told us the other day, they contract out 90% of their service. 90%, that's a lot. So it's all of the paratransit, it's all of the bus operations, it's all of the, we have light rail now, all of the light rail operations. There's only a little bit of work that's even done in-house anymore. So effectively, the Phoenix Public Transit Agency is one that is basically a contract administrator at this point. And that is something, I'm going to come to this in a minute, that is pretty common. But in terms of the types of public-private partnerships, advertising, then we have the contracts that I'm talking about, like operating bus lines, maintenance contracts, that sort of thing. Where it's really going, and probably not at the Wichita level yet, but places, the big cities like Denver and some others out there are looking at how can we actually not just do contracting with, pay someone to provide a service cheaper, but where can we actually get private dollars to the table to deploy on building public infrastructure assets? So Denver, for instance, has got private financing to build an expansion of its light rail system. And other cities are looking at those sorts of things. And so actually getting, not just saving money through contracting and that sort of thing, but actually getting private capital to the table. But this is not a panacea. This is not always going to work. A lot depends on how you go through this process and how you run a procurement and that sort of thing. But what we tend to find, I'm going to come to this more in a second, is that this is a proven tool, especially in transit and public works agencies, for delivering better service. Because you're bringing competition to bear in a system that is very monopolistic. I mean, that's the bottom line. If you're providing services in-house, and you're not bidding those out on a regular basis, you're dropping the ball. You are not bringing value to the table, or at least bringing some competitive tension to the system. Even just the process of going and getting the bids tends to make the public employees and the unions think a little bit differently about how they provide their services. Putting that competition or that tension in the system can be a very, very profound way to increase efficiency, even if you don't actually ultimately contract out the service in the end. Some cities, in fact, we pioneered this in Phoenix, but Charlotte, others do a lot of what's called managed competition, where you actually force the public employees to bid against the private sector for providing services, and you do it on a regular basis. The public employees often win those, but what you effectively do is you push them into the situation where they have to compete. They have to think a little bit more entrepreneurially about how do we actually streamline ourselves, as opposed to waiting for a manager to do it for them. Really, they know how to provide the service. They just don't tend to be in a system that rewards innovation and efficiency. So if you force that through a competitive system, they may win it, but you're going to save money along the way because you basically create a system where they can streamline themselves. So let's just talk about transit for a minute, some of the rules for PPPs and competitive contracting. But let me just start by saying, I looked into this with Wichita. It looks like you did, actually many years ago, contract out a lot of your operations. I think back in the late 2000s, 2007, 2008, you went back and, do I have that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So you did at one point competitively contract out, and from my understanding, just based on some news articles I read, which may or may not be completely accurate, there were some performance issues, and it was decided back then to bring those services back in-house. And so I'm assuming that a lot of your bus service is now provided internally. Is that your? I want to make sure that's not mine. It sounds like my alarm. I'm so used to hearing it. So I'm not going to say that there's magic by going out to the market to try to provide something. You may have some issues. What I tend to find, though, is that quick decision to just, okay, well, this didn't work, and let's bring it back in-house, tends to be a little bit rash, from my experience, having studied this issue, not just in roads and transit, but in all kinds of things in local and state governments. I tend to think it's better to go back out to the market and recompete, and maybe rethink what you're going to ask. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. So, but look, this is not something new and crazy. I mean, this is what cities across the country do as a common practice. I have a list up there. Phoenix, I mentioned, 90% contracted. San Diego, Denver do a lot of this sort of thing. Even very, what you might call, left-wing places like LA and San Francisco and California do lots of contracting out. Okay, so this is not something that is unheard of or crazy. In fact, it's very routine. And this could be a lot of different things. It could be fleet maintenance, it could be just operating lines or rail systems or sort of that sort of thing through a contract. The Transportation Research Board, it's been a while, nobody really dives too deeply into this. We're down in the weeds of transportation-related issues. But the Transportation Research Board, which is one of the branches of the national academies, researched this issue of competitive contracting back in 2001. And they basically found that 90% of transit system managers that have used competitive contracting reported that their expectations were realized and most found cost savings. And so, and I think I have it later, but when they asked, would you do it again, I think something like over 80% said yes, they would. And it's part of it is cost savings. That's one of the reasons that people tend to get into this issue. But beyond that, other rationales for it were being more efficient, bringing new business-like thinking to their operations, and really just bringing more competition and flexibility. And having the ability to maybe dial up or down service levels in a much easier way than you can if you have hired employees who have one job, and to try to shuffle them from one function to another, or try to maybe rebalance the way you provide services can be a lot trickier in that kind of public sector labor environment than it would be through a contract type of system. I mentioned some of this already. Las Vegas is another place that does, they contract out their entire bus operations, and they found there that they're getting savings on the order of 30%. Colorado is interesting. They actually have a law, a state law, that mandated competitive contracting in transit. And so Denver was sort of the big transit agency in that state. And they found that, over a greater than a decade period back in the late 80s through early 2000s, that they were achieving about the same thing, cost savings of 30%, and they were able to increase their service levels by 90%. With also increases in safety and quality. So this is not, again, this is something that's not crazy or radical out there. It's actually happening. I have a quote here from an interview I did with their former transit chief, Cal Marcella, where he was just talking about how they had about just nearly 50% of their service operated through contracting, all of their paratransit operations. And so they saw big per hour, savings through this. And so some of it was through labor, and then additional savings through, the avoidance of other expenditures. And so it's in your packet, so I won't read the whole thing. Road maintenance is another place where we see a lot of contracting. I mentioned that earlier. One of the things, though, that I mentioned is that it tends to be very disaggregated. That's whether you're talking about local governments or at the state level. And the states have been the real pioneers here. Because what they've started to do is say, look, this whole discrete piecemealing, short-term kind of thinking, we're doing a lot of contracts, but that brings a lot of administration that goes along with it. So we have to sign lots of checks and go through lots of different contracts just to make sure that a road is well maintained and cleared and has good signage and all that sort of thing, guardrail or what have you. They started thinking, what if we, and they really brought this from overseas with some innovations that were happening in places like Australia, New Zealand, Europe, where governments were saying, look, rather than piecemeal this out, what if we bundled it together? And what if we just did, you see this under different names, performance-based maintenance, total asset management. These are terms that they've come to think of. The simplest for the average person, because I didn't know anything about this when I learned it, is fence-to-fence maintenance, meaning from fence line to fence line or from border to border of your road, everything in between would go into that contract. Snow plowing, might be part of that too. But definitely pavements, signage, landscaping, the big ones. And so rather than having all these discrete contracts, do one contract. And rather than doing it through this sort of very annual or short-term process, where the bid that you get next year is going to be a little bit higher than the bid that you had this year, what if we did it on a fixed cost basis but stretched out the contract? So you give the private guy some certainty that he's got the contract for a while. They're going to be more willing then to say, well, we'll be more predictable in how we come back to you in terms of cost. And so so rather than having this highly variable system, getting into where you can basically fix your maintenance cost over these are typically 5 to 10 year sorts of contracts. And the other part of it is governments tend to, in maintenance, be very prescriptive. Meaning they'll build contracts, but the contracts basically say, you have to do it this way. You have to do the contract. These are all the things. Maybe it's the way that we were doing it. If the government was providing before, you have to check all these boxes in terms of how you provide this function or how you maintain it. As opposed to just saying, we want the road without potholes. We want the grass no higher than 2 or 3 inches. Go for it. We don't care how you do it. We're not going to micromanage your process. We just want you to give us an end goal, which is a performance-based, a performance-driven road, right? And so letting really the contractor decide the methods while you as a contracting entity, as a government, decide the outcome. And so states have started to experiment with this. Virginia was the first, and they bundled up 1,000 miles of interstate back in the late 90s. 1,000 miles of interstate where they just put it out to bid and said, we're not going to piecemeal this anymore, give us your best bid, we'll do longer term contracts. And they ended up getting bids in that were somewhere between 6 to 20% lower than what they were paying as a DOT, as a State Department of Transportation. They have since expanded that to lots of other highways in that state. Now Florida is basically doing this statewide. They've got this all across the state. In fact, they've condensed 900 contracts, something like 800 to 900 contracts, down to about 30 to 40, which is huge in terms of administrative costing. And Texas now is starting to look at this, and they rolled out a pilot in Houston last year where they were doing maintenance on highways. They found about $10 million in savings, which equated to about 30% of what the DOT had been spending to do that maintenance. It's traditional. And so not only are these places getting savings in that kind of range, but they're also reducing their administrative internal costs of just contract management. Now, that has primarily been a state-level issue, but what we're starting to see are experiments at the local level. I've heard from a number of communities in Florida that are starting to take this approach at the local level and bring it in, maybe sometimes on a pilot basis, maybe in a district or something like that, not citywide yet. Centennial, Colorado is one that actually has gone to more of this kind of model. They're basically a contract city in the Denver metro area, which outsources pretty much everything that's not public safety. Not 100%, but pretty close. They basically outsource their entire public works department. So rather, they don't have an in-house public works anymore. They have a director who sort of oversees that work and manages the contract, but that's it. Contractors provide everything else. And so they have a vendor who provides all of these services that are sort of bundled into these sorts of contracts. So anyway, that's something that is happening out there. It takes a lot of political will to make that sort of thing happen. But it is something worth, I think, exploring in this context. Again, this is kind of whether or not the sales tax passes or not. So I just want to wrap up here with a couple of considerations to sort of think about this and how you think about moving forward with funding your transit and street improvements, and really in the context of this proposed tax. I mentioned this one already, but how would sales tax revenues, your projections that you're looking at today, 400 million or whatever, what's that based on? Is that based on an annual increase over the 5 years? 5 years is a tighter window. I'd expect it's a little bit closer to what we got in Phoenix, where they were looking at 20 years, anticipating 5% year-over-year growth. But that's one that I think is a very important question to ask. What are you expecting, and what happens if next year we have another downturn? What happens to that? So that's actually the first two bullets. The next one kind of came earlier. Someone asked this earlier. What happens if I think a variation on this question, but what happens if those revenues don't materialize? Or what happens, I guess the related question would be, what happens if policymakers decide they're going to take from this bucket and move it over here? What are the protections on this money? And if you're not talking about bonded debt, I don't know that there would be that many protections. I don't know how legally, you can tell me, I haven't read the fine print of your ballot measure, but what happens if someone decides, we're not going to spend that on this, transit this year? What can you do about it? I don't know. You can complain. You can vote people out of office. But beyond that, I don't know. You have to sort of think also about the macro level issues. And this is getting sort of beyond the transportation side of it. But just what are the risks to the local economy? Certainly raising a sales tax has an economic impact. I don't think anybody, I know that it's for infrastructure and everything, the infrastructure related components, at least that are in your ballot measure, are things that are necessary to a functioning community. But you also have to balance that out with what are the risks, and is this the best way to do it? Also, there's a regressivity issue when you start talking about a sales tax. Sales tax tends to hit poorer people disproportionately harder. The other thing, getting back to transportation, and this came up in Wendell's talk, but what are sort of the potential impacts of new technologies out there? Things like Uber. I realize we're at the very beginning stages, but already Uber's going to launch a transit service. That's something that's probably not going to roll out here in Wichita before it rolls out in San Francisco or LA, but that's something to think about into the future in terms of how you prioritize investments. Also, just in terms of spending, one of the things I would think about, you're already contracting out things like paratransit, but you have to also contextualize, well, is there does it make more sense to spend money on our own sort of fleet and operations versus, at least for some segment or some areas, providing some subsidy for people to use services like Uber and that sort of thing. These are bigger questions than you're probably going to confront on a sales tax measure, but it's worth thinking about in terms of how you think about the future of transit. The reason I want to make sure that going back to this issue of, what happens if the sales tax revenues aren't there. I want to show you the real world numbers from Phoenix. This is from the city's public transit department. This light blue line is sales tax revenue off our 0.4 or 0.4 sales tax. This is what they sold voters on every year going up, and I crunched this number. That is about 4.8% annual growth. Okay, these are the numbers that they came back that actually materialized. Okay, in 1, 2, 3 years, it was slightly higher than that. Look at the rest. So what does that lead to? The delta there actually ends up being about $800 million. So these little gaps all add up to $800 million over a 20-year period. So what this shows, because they're sort of starting to make the case, we need more tax revenue, right? This bottom part is the transit sales tax. This is what they projected. That's what all those bars increasing would have been. 2.9 billion. It ends up being 2.1. That's a big delta. You add the other things onto it that also, didn't really pan out quite as well as they thought, including federal funds. It's $1 billion shortfall over a 20-year period. That's the risk. So what happens is they sold voters on, we're going to build X number of miles of light rail, we're going to add this kind of bus service here and there, we're going to do express bus service, we're going to do street improvements. No, some of it got done, but $1 billion of it didn't. And so that's a pretty significant gap to have to overcome after you've sold voters on, vote for this and here's what we promise. So it's something worth thinking about. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about this, and it sounds like you guys, both Steve and Alan, have been doing some work. I mean, the first question that I would have in this kind of situation is, what are you doing to maximize your current dollars, right? So efficiency. And that's what these bullets are really getting towards, and you're starting to do some of that. The pavement management stuff is fantastic. You've looked at your service levels in lots of different ways and are looking at how can we change our services to really get people to where they need to go. That's all very important thinking. This one though, I mean, as a taxpayer, this is the one that's the most important to me, which is, before you ask me for more money, tell me, where are you spending this other money? Okay, and so, I mean, part of this is, there is a decision-making component at the policymaker level that says to me, and this is common, it's not just here, it's everywhere. What are your priorities? How are you prioritizing things like transit and street maintenance? I mean, these are fundamental things to a community. Where are subsidies going? These are questions that I would be asking policy. It's not questions for Steve and Alan. They deal with what the policymakers are doing. These are questions for the city council and the mayor to say, you're asking for tax dollars, but tell us what you're spending, where are you spending our money on? This is a bigger question than can be answered, in the next 2 weeks. But this is something for the long term you really have to think about. And, have you talked about doing priority-based budgeting, where you kind of get citizens in the room to sort of think about what are the priorities, and then let's fund down through those priorities, and then we spend down to the amount of money we have. We know we've covered first things first. What's left underneath that? Sorry, we don't have the money for it, but we know that they're not the priorities. That's the kind of thinking that you need for your policymakers, on these sorts of issues. And the other question, I guess, just kind of getting back to the more mundane level of funding is, is there any, have you talked with your county? One of the things that we have seen out there at the local level is a lot of joint delivery of services between municipalities and their counties. I don't know if that's possible here, I just throw it out as a question. But is there any talk about, possibly combining services, or saying if someone has any competitive advantage on costs in road maintenance or that sort of thing? Maybe it's I don't know. It's just a question for consideration. Almost last. On the strategy side of this, is the sales tax the best approach for this infrastructure? Personally, I prefer bonds for infrastructure. That's what bonds are there for. Bonds are there to provide revenue to build infrastructure that has a long life, and then the users or the people pay back those bonds over that life. Because it's just like a mortgage or something else. You're sort of paying over a long term because you're going to derive the benefits of that asset over the long term. Taxes, I'm less bullish on, especially sales taxes because of the volatility. And I mean, I've just seen so many situations in which sales taxes for infrastructure fall short of delivering what's promised that I'm inherently a little skeptical of. But I would just ask that question. Right now you've got a lot of things bundled into this tax. What does that look like if you break it out? It's a little, one of the reasons that policymakers tend to dump a lot of things into a sales tax proposal like this is because it's somebody who may not care about water may care about roads, or somebody who may care about economic development may not care about transit, but you throw them all together into the big bundle, well, it becomes easier to pull a lot of people into voting for it. That's a tactic. I tend to be more, let's dedicate revenues to certain things and let's be very clear on it. That's my preference. I'm not saying, that should be yours. I just think that that's something worth considering. Are the promised projects well defined? It sounds like they are. You showed a map of your street projects. That's something you can take to citizens. I think your transit projects are. I don't know if that translates across the board to everything that's included in this, but that's something to ask. This going back again to that question earlier, how do we know that revenues are siloed? Do we? I don't know if that's the case. And does it do enough? Is this the right, and this kind of goes back to, is this the best approach? You were talking about getting 111 additional lane miles on the roadside. I just picked this out as an example. But that's a tiny bit more than what would happen under the status quo. Is that the right approach? And that's what I would be questioning policymakers on. And it sounds like, based on your discussion, Alan, that even if you do have that funding, you're going to still see a decline in quality of your system. That's an important thing that I think sort of transcends this short-term political battle. The policymakers really need to have their feet held to the fire. So for taxpayers out there, I would keep pushing them. Is the relative balance of spending right? That's sort of the breakout that I saw in one of the newspaper articles. I'm assuming that's correct. Is that right? These are questions to ask. And then, there's this one I was asking because I saw a presentation on a website that was suggesting that the new fleet was going to have Wi-Fi and the buses, it's going to have Wi-Fi and some other amenities. That to me, I may be wrong here, to me it looked like there was maybe an attempt to try to pull some of those more choice riders in. From your presentation, it doesn't sound like that's where you were going. So I don't know if this is really a consideration, but from the American Community Survey data, that's 2013, I believe, most of your riders appear to be under $25,000 a year of income. Is the investments that you're going to be making, is that going to attract more ridership? Because I know that ridership increase is something that you're looking at. So, this is more of a question before I heard your presentation. It doesn't sound like that's where you're going though, if I'm correct. Anyway, that's it. I want to wrap up with that. I really thank you. Be happy to take any questions and really appreciate you coming today.